Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at the Middle Ages and the rise of Europe. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson, scroll down the correct section, and get ready to fill in the blanks with the key content that corresponds to the presentation. Please remember that you can play any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition later on. Let's go ahead and get started. This is the story of the Middle Ages. Essential question: what was life like during the Middle Ages? What two groups settled together to make Russia, and name two ways that the Byzantine Empire influenced Russia too? So what exactly happened to Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire? As you can see here, a variety of different outsiders known as barbarians, including of course Visigoths and other conquerors like Vikings, took over the Roman Empire at different times, and with relative success brought the end and its demise. The eastern half of the Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire became a center for trade and Greco-Roman culture. The influence of the Roman Empire from Rome itself were still felt here in the satellite parts of its empire. The western half fell to various Germanic tribes, as stated before, who created their own kingdoms out of the former Roman territory. Europe was plunged into an era called the Middle Ages, but also known as the Dark Ages too, or the medieval era, from around 500 to 1300. When Western Europe was plagued by constant warfare between the Germanic barbarian kingdoms, basically the withering away of stability was seen. The warring between kingdoms disrupted trade, causing businesses to collapse. European cities were damaged by the war and or left in financial ruin, and city dwellers fled to the countryside to survive, and Western Europe became mostly rural and agrarian. Now, the warfare made life dangerous and difficult for Europeans, so as a result, the finer things in life, such as higher learning, became less and less important. In some places in the Dark Ages in Europe, writing totally disappeared. Literacy decreased among Western Europeans, and few people could read or write aside from priests and the rich people. The ruling Germans had no written language at the time. Greco-Roman culture was mostly forgotten in Western Europe. Now, Europe lost its common language, and Latin mixed with Germanic dialects and evolved into new languages, such as Spanish, French, and Italian, languages that are still around today. Without the unity of the Roman Empire, Europe became divided into a series of Germanic kingdoms, which ruled Western Europe for many years. Now, Germanic people lived in small communities led by chiefs and as loyal warriors. Family ties and personal loyalty were more important than citizenship to a state or loyalty to a king that they had never even met. And rather than living by written laws, like the Romans, the Germans were guided by unwritten laws, or informal laws, and tradition. Let's talk about the spread of Christianity. During the early Middle Ages, the Germanic kingdoms were slowly converted to Christianity. Some attribute the rise of Christianity to the fall of Rome. The Catholic Pope became involved in secular non-religious issues like road repair, aiding the poor, and helping Christian kings expand their power, justifiably so. The Franks were the largest and most powerful of the Germanic kingdoms in the early Middle Ages, as depicted here on this map. Frankish kings allied with the Catholic Church and expanded their power over much of Western Europe. In the year 771, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, became the king of the Franks. Now, Charlemagne was the greatest medieval king because he did something no other medieval king was able to do: create a formal, organized empire, which was a rarity for the time. As you can see here by this map, Charlemagne and the Frankish Empire expanded its rule and territorial control over much of Western Europe. Charlemagne expanded the Frankish Empire, and additionally, throughout the Frankish Empire, Charlemagne spread Christianity too. Sometimes religion and government control in world history goes hand in hand. He valued learning and built schools in his empire. Thus, some would attribute bringing an end to the Dark Ages. He created schools to train future priests, and of course these priests would play a key part in spreading Christianity too. Now, after Charlemagne's death in 814, his Frankish Empire lost power and was divided. This was the last opportunity to provide unity in medieval Europe, and that opportunity died with Charlemagne. From 800 to 1000, a second major wave of invasion struck Europe. The first wave of attacks was by the Germanic barbarians that took over Western Rome, and then additionally, the second wave of invasions was led by Vikings, the Muslims, and the Magyars. As depicted here, you can see their attack route. Now, these invasions caused widespread fear and suffering. So rightfully so, Western Europe's kings could not defend against these invaders. People stopped looking to kings for protection, and so what happened next was the rise of a medieval tradition that was in place for many years. So basically, the way that people got protection from outside invaders was by turning to local lords and noblemen instead of the nation's king. This began a new political and social system called feudalism, kind of similar to Japanese feudalism if you remember that from a previous unit. Feudalism is based on land ownership and loyalty. Landowning lords offer pieces of land called a fief to knights, and in exchange, knights offer lords their loyalty and a promise to protect the lord and his land. Here's an example of the European feudal structure during medieval times. Up here at the top, you can see there's the king, followed by the church officials and the nobles, followed by knights as a warrior class in the center, and then peasants and serfs at the bottom. Lords, also called nobles, were the upper-class landowners. They had inherited titles such as duke or earl and sir, and held the most power in a feudal society. Additionally, the most powerful lords had lesser lords who worked for them, and these less powerful lords were called vassals, often wearing the garb depicted here. In the feudal system, kings were the highest-ranking lords and had wealth and land, but actually did not hold the ultimate real power. You see, in the Middle Ages, power was spread out and shared among numerous lords, not concentrated with a single monarch at top. Knights were specially trained soldiers and armored horsemen who protected the lords and peasants in exchange for land. And additionally, some peasants that lived in medieval Europe were serfs. They weren't slaves per se, who could be bought and sold, but they were not free either. In many ways, they were tied to the land. They had to farm and do all types of physical labor in service to their lords and could not leave the land freely on their own. In return for their service, though, the serfs could farm a few acres for themselves and were given protection from outside invaders such as Vikings. During the Middle Ages, the manorial system was the way in which people survived. Here's a depiction of what a manor looked like during this era. The lord's land was called a manor, and as you can see, there's an elaborate system of buildings, structures, fortifications on purpose. Now, the manorial system, of course, was complex for the time, as it consisted of the manor or the lord's home, church, mills, mill ponds, villages, community pastures, woodlots, and lands for lord's personal use. The lord provided peasants with housing, farmland, and protection, and this give-and-take system actually worked quite well for the people, most people, and all those involved. In exchange, peasants repaid the lord by working his land and providing a portion of the food that they produced. Manors were self-sufficient communities, and everything that was needed was produced on the manor itself. So in many ways, these small manors became self-sufficient societies. However, peasant life was still hard, and the days were filled by tough physical labor. They paid taxes to use the lord's mill to make their bread for themselves, and had to get the lord's permission for most things, including getting married. Peasant life was also short. The average life expectancy of common folk in the Middle Ages was only 35 years old, so that's substantially young. In addition, over time, though, lords built castles to protect their territory from outside invasions. And with relative success, castles and forts like this became icons of the medieval era. Both the attackers and the defenders of a castle would use the most modern weaponry of the time to fight each other, as seen here, by weapons like the siege tower, the mantlet, the battering ram, the trebuchet, the tortoise, and the megonel. Now, as you guys can see, there's much to be said here about medieval Europe, but I think one of the biggest thematic takeaways here is that we see the rise and formation of society after a period of great tumult and great trouble, thus showing that even though society may not advance in a linear trajectory, the fact is that with different forms of civilization and different cultural attributes, society can rise and thrive again. Although medieval Europe would be plagued with its own set of problems, as we'll discuss in future lessons, the fact is that the medieval times represent a unique and eclectic era of world history. Thank you so much for tuning in, and go on with completing the rest of the lesson.